Welcome to this week's Odyssey Book Club. It's great to see so many faces here again. Before we get started, just a few quick announcements of different ways that you can engage with and connect with and support our department. So we have an upcoming event on May 14th at 5:30 p.m. This is Homer and the Odyssey, a virtual event. So good for those of you who are participating virtually now. This is with Professors James Porter and Mario Tillot. So I hope you'll join us for another extension of our big Odyssey theme this semester. And more importantly, maybe, is just a thank you. It's been so wonderful to have this group and to share this space with all of you and see how much support you've given us, especially at the Big Give a few weeks ago. So your support means so much to all of us here in the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies, but also those of us at ARF, Archaeological Research Facility, and the Nemea Center. So thank you. It really means a lot. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now and take us straight in because we're actually at a really exciting part of our reading journey, which is that now we've actually entered the second half of the poem. And we talked a little bit about this the first time we met, but that it's really in the second half of the poem where all the different narrative lines intermingle. So when we left off last time, we had Odysseus just sort of wrapping up the story of his wanderings to the Phaeacians. And now in book 13, we find him there again, still in Scyria, in the court of the Phaeacians. And he's sitting amidst the feast, growing increasingly eager to go home. So Alcinous quickly puts together a ship and a crew at Odysseus's request, and they all get aboard. It's time to go home. Once aboard, Odysseus immediately falls asleep and stays asleep until they reach Ithaca. The Phaeacians just sort of gently put him on the shore and head home. But they don't actually make it there because Poseidon turns their ship into a rock out of punishment for doing this escort service. So Odysseus wakes up on the shores of Ithaca, and Athena appears before him. She advises him to tell no one of his identity and to go first to the hut of Eumaeus, his swineherd. She changes his appearance so no one will recognize him. She makes him look older and she makes him look like a beggar. In book 14, Odysseus arrives at Eumaeus's hut, and Eumaeus receives him and offers him humble but incredibly generous hospitality. The two talk. Eumaeus describes his grief for Odysseus's absence and the fate of his household. And Odysseus tells him a series of lies, which are basically the backstory for the person he appears to be now. And some of these stories actually include Odysseus himself. And he even goes so far as to claim that Odysseus will be on Ithaca with very, very soon. Eumaeus doesn't believe him on this last point, and this is because there have been a lot of people wandering by seeking to trade stories for rewards. Book 15 is split, much like the first half of the poem, between Odysseus and his son Telemachus. So while Odysseus sits in Eumaeus's hut, we watch Telemachus journey back home, first on horseback from Sparta to Pylos, and then by boat from Pylos to Ithaca, all the while trying to avoid the suitors who are plotting against him. In Eumaeus's hut, Odysseus and Eumaeus continue to talk, and Eumaeus describes the fate of Odysseus's father and mother and shares his own story of how he came to be enslaved in Odysseus's household. When Telemachus reaches Ithaca, he makes his way to Eumaeus's hut, as Athena commanded him, and sends the rest of his crew and Theoclymenus onwards to the city. Odysseus's and Telemachus's storylines converge in the first moments of Book 16, when Telemachus arrives in Eumaeus's hut. Telemachus and Eumaeus share an affectionate embrace, and together with disguised Odysseus, the three of them sit down to eat a meal. Telemachus sends Eumaeus off to the palace to send word to his mother that he's returned home safely. And while he's gone, Athena transforms Odysseus into a younger version of himself, and he reveals his identity to his son. The two then make a plan to take vengeance on the suitors and anyone who had supported them. And then finally, when Eumaeus returns, Athena changes Odysseus quickly back into his beggar's disguise. So these are a really interesting set of books where all these different storylines sort of come together. And today it's my pleasure to announce Professor Nelly Oliensis, who we have with us to help us unpack what's happening here. Nelly Oliensis is the Clio Distinguished Professor of Classical Languages and Literature and a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature. She's a literary critic with particular interests in the intersections of literary form and psychoanalysis. Her most recent book is a study of Ovid's love poetry, and her current book project is a commentary on Ovid's Metamorphoses 6. Though most of her publications center on Roman poetry, she has a long-standing obsession with Homer, especially the Odyssey, and she welcomes the opportunity to return to Homer whenever it comes her way. So we're very lucky Professor Oliensis took this opportunity. Thank you for being here to guide us through these books. And I'll hand over the floor to you now to hear what you want to share with us.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Cecily. It's also so helpful to have the content of these books before us because they're really various, and there are a lot of different kinds of things going on. So I have to apologize to everyone out there because my Zoom, maybe it stopped. Is it still tracking me? If it isn't, that's very good news. I was going to alert people to the possibility that you might feel a little seasick, but I'm glad if that's passed. So there were before I jump in, there were basically three questions that came in ahead of time, which I thought I'd respond to. They're really different from each other, but they're all really interesting. One of them was from Mary, asking about that little phrase that Mendelssohn uses repeatedly, his words or her words, like as a complete sentence. And she was wondering why Mendelssohn is doing that and what it's representing. And there's nothing like that in other translations. So what Mendelssohn is doing there is he is reproducing a very short formula that often comes at the beginning of a line to kind of close off a speech. It's like a close quotes formula. So it's either hos fato or hos ephath, depending on the metrical needs of the line. And I think the reason he does that little thing, his words, is that he wants to keep it really short. It really is just like close quotes. Whereas if it's a longer response line, like she responded, then responded at there are many elaborate formulae for people responding to speeches. Those he will give a full line, but this one he just does the little thing. So that's what that is. Okay. Another question that came up, Lorraine and Jeff both asked about the direct address to Eumaeus. Which happens a lot and is really noticeable. He's the only character in the poem who gets directly addressed by the poet. So it's Eumae subota is the phrase, and it comes up a lot at the end of the line. So here I'm going to say basically what Leslie Kirk said a couple of times in her lecture, which is your interpretation is as good as anyone's. There have been lots of thoughts about why it is that Homer addresses Eumaeus in the Odyssey. In the Iliad, there are direct addresses to two characters, Patroclus and Menelaus. And again, a lot of people have thought and had all kinds of ideas about that, but honestly, it's not like there's just an answer to that question. I mean, it's at least interesting that all the characters Homer directly addresses are kind of to the side. He doesn't address Achilles or Odysseus. He doesn't really go for the main players. To call them lower status, that's a weird thing to say about Menelaus and Patroclus, but Menelaus is sort of, the lesser partner and the brother to his brother Agamemnon, and Patroclus is the kind of beloved companion of Achilles. So some people have processed those direct addresses as kind of taking the perspective of Achilles or Agamemnon. And yes, as I think Jeff said, suggested, this, some people have taken this as processing the perspective of Odysseus on Eumaeus. But this is one of the fun things you can it's your call. Okay. And the third question is it came from Maxine, and this was about um meat eating. Why is it that everyone is always eating meat and drinking wine, and occasionally there's bread? And Maxine asked, didn't they have vegetables? Did they not grow vegetables? Okay. I have nothing to do with sort of the like food ways. This is not my area. I'm pretty confident in saying that they did have vegetables, in ancient Greece. But within this poem, meat has a kind of all kinds of like thematic resonance and weight. So in a kind of Greek context, this really goes back to Hesiod. Eating cooked animal flesh is what distinguishes human beings from gods who live on nectar and ambrosia, and also from animals who, eat each other raw or whatever. Actually, there are plenty of animals that eat vegetables as well. Okay. Um, but eating cooked meat also distinguishes, proper human beings, proper civilized human beings from those weird other kind of eating habited people like what you can go through Odysseus's travels and his adventures and basically map out where he is according to what people are eating. So, you've got the lotus eaters, that's like, not really kosher. Then you've got the Cyclops and the Lystrigonians who eat people, cannibalism. This is another kind of deviation. So that's what, Eumaeus has a proper sacrifice. I think it's in book 15. They have a feast and he sacrifices and prays to the gods and does the whole ritual routine. This is something you never see the suitors doing. The suitors eat a lot of meat, but they don't do it in a very proper way. And there's also that recurring issue with the suitors that there's this figuration that they're not just eating a lot of animals, they're gobbling up Odysseus's household. So they're kind of figuratively sort of set up as being cannibal-like or somehow eating in an improper way. So that's a long answer to actually a really important question about meat. And I will just throw in that if you want, and there's been great work on this by sort of structuralist scholars back in the day, but you can go through the adventures and you can look at what people eat. Do they do agriculture? You know, Mostly the answer is no. And what are their marital arrangements like? Even the Phaeacians, I think this was mentioned before, it's a little weird with Alcinous and Arete, and it's like she's either his niece or there's some, there's something kind of slightly incestuous there. Again, incest is something for the gods, but not for proper human beings. Okay, that's just that's that. Okay, so all right, so yeah, books 13 through 16. So I really love the second half of the Odyssey. I've always really loved the second half of the Odyssey, partly because it's kind of surprising that there is a second half to the Odyssey. I mean, I think when I first encountered the Odyssey in like junior high, it was just the adventures. And I think this came up earlier. Someone was asking about it, right? It's just the exciting adventures with the Cyclops and the sirens and all those things. In fact, the poem spends a huge amount of time in Ithaca. Right? And it takes Odysseus a really long time. It takes the poem a really long time to accomplish his return, his nostos. So, and, of course, it could have been done otherwise. It could have been done differently. So, my main question that I'm interested in thinking about today, of all the many things that one could be thinking about in this section of the poem, is what's up? Why does it take Odysseus so long to get it? Why is there a second half of the Odyssey? Okay, so that's one thing. And then the other issue I'm kind of interested in thinking about which is related, is what is the impact of the time that Odysseus has been away from Ithaca, right? How does the poem process or register the fact that Odysseus has been gone for 20 years? That's like a whole generation. It's a kind of stunning amount of time. Okay. So, um, last time, I think someone asked a question about why Odysseus's adventures, the really famous, memorable part of the poem, gets kind of squeezed together in the middle of the poem. And there are many different reasons, many different things that, one could say about that issue. Like, for example, the fact that Homer kind of disavows those stories. He doesn't say they're not true, but he doesn't vouch for them. He doesn't vouch for them in the form that we get them, and we would be foolish to take anything Odysseus says simply at face value. So there's that. But the other effect of that decision to have those adventures narrated by Odysseus in a flashback when he's on Scheria with the Phaeacians is that it means that the poem doesn't start with Odysseus, leaving Troy, right? And then having all his adventures. The poem starts in Ithaca, and then it ends in Ithaca. It returns to Ithaca. So the poem itself kind of accomplishes the same return that its hero is going for. Okay, so I want to spend some time on book 13 because that's kind of, the moment. Whoops, I just did full screen, which I really don't want to do. There. That's the moment when Odysseus finally he's back in Ithaca, right? So it's a kind of crucial transitional moment. And at this point, I am going to attempt to share my screen. And this is the only time I'm going to do this today. There's just wanted to show you a couple of things from early in the book. So let me see if I can do this. There, this might work. Is that visible? Is that
It's
kind of
visible.
visible? Is this
Yeah,
better?
that's perfect.
Okay. So this is the moment that Cecily was talking about. It's the last night, with the Phaeacians, and they have, one of their wonderful banquets, and Demodocus is up there ready to perform. And what I love about this moment is it's the first time in the poem where we don't hear Demodocus's song. And Odysseus is not interested. He's not listening. In the middle of the line, right, it switches over. Then the bard, Demodocus, honored by all the people, sang to them. But Odysseus, kept turning his head, right? Cecily mentioned this. He's just super anxious to get home, and he's already dislocated from the songs that Demodocus, might tell about returns as and then or about the Trojan War and actually where he's headed. So, all right, then right after this, there's a fantastic simile, which I did. Whoops, did it go? No, it's because I'm in full screen. Okay, continue to share. This is going to look bad. Forgive me. Um, view. Is that better? Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. That's the same one as before. There we go.
Yeah, it's the
Yay.
same.
Did it switch?
I'm not seeing it change. It's different than the one you just showed us, but
But is it readable?
it is
They
readable.
dined on a
Yes.
splendid feast,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, what I like here is, but Odysseus kept turning his head toward the sun, which sheds brilliance everywhere, eager for it to set. Truly, he yearned to go home. And what I love here is this kept turning, right? Pola trepe. Pola trepe. It's the same, it is, those are the words from which that adjective polutropos is compounded, right? That word that shows up in the very first line of the poem. Andromoi enepe musa polutropon, right? Odysseus is the turning, the much turning hero, and everyone loves this word because it covers so much, both his actual travels and his intellect. But this time, all the turning is oriented toward his return, right? He's turning, but he's aiming for his nostos. And I like that this passage ends with this verb neesthai, um, you know, uh, which is from the same root as return. Okay, so this is something I'm kind of obsessed with, is this relationship between turning and returning, or being polutropos and being, the man of nostos, these two dimensions of Odysseus. And then we get the simile. Okay, so he as a man will yearn for his supper when his team with their wine-colored coats have been pulling the sturdy plow through the fallow fields all day long. Okay. This is a wonderful simile, partly because that adjective oinope, right, wine-colored, comes up a lot in the Odyssey, uh, in association with the sea. That's a formulaic phrase, epi oinopaponton, which comes up, the wine dark sea, right? It's a very famous phrase. This is the only other way it's used within the Odyssey is in this simile in relation to oxen. Okay. Oxen with wine-colored coats. And I like the fact, although I wouldn't want to put too much weight on it, that the word neion at the beginning of the line, which is like a fallow field, sounds a little bit like the Greek word for ships, at least in the plural nees, right? It's kind of similar. So that's all I wanted to show you. I'm now going to cease sharing my screen. But what I like about this moment, am I still sharing? Stop share. Okay. What I like about this moment is that it takes a figure that is associated with Odysseus's wanderings and reapplies it to the sphere of agriculture. Let me just quit that, right? So, on the one hand, um, agriculture and sailing have a certain amount in common, right? They're both, let's see, I just saw something in the chat, but I missed it. Oh, yeah, I guess that was before. All right. Both sailing and agriculture are things that, that they're associated with civilized human beings. This is, the Cyclops doesn't do that kind of thing, right? He doesn't, they know nothing about sailing and they don't seem to do agriculture. Things just seem to get produced for them and so on. But sailing and agriculture are also in other ways, they're contrasting activities, right? Sailing the barren sea, plowing the sea, which is a common figure, it yields nothing, right? It's a very different model from plowing the earth and, producing fruits, right? Or producing grain. So the simile is also marking the transition that Odysseus is on the verge of making from his experience as a sea wandering seafarer to the Odysseus who will be, rooted and placed in Ithaca and will be a practitioner of agriculture. And it's not an accident that when he finally recognizes Ithaca, he falls on the earth and he kisses the grain-giving earth, it says, right? So there's that agricultural link. Okay. So okay. And this whole reorientation is also underscored by a passage, and Daniel Mendelsohn points out that very closely echoes the opening of the poem. This is page 269. I'll just read you a couple of lines, but 269 to 70. This is when the Phaeacians are carrying him off on the ship. The ship sliced through the swells, carrying a man who resembled the gods in council, who had suffered many a toil, anguish in his heart. That's a direct quote from the opening lines of the poem. So what I'm trying to get at is that there are a lot of things early in book 13 which make it seem that we're really at an end, that we've really achieved closure. The poem has come full circle. The guy has finally arrived on Ithaca. He's left the sea behind. He's reoriented toward the land. But that's not right. That it's not going to happen until we get through book 24. So I'm going to say there are, several reasons why it takes so long for the poem to end. And let me say, I'm glad that it takes so long for it to end. One is just at the level of plot, right? So we know that there's a very bad situation back home in Ithaca, back in the palace. That is not going to be easily addressed. Odysseus and Telemachus and his small number of allies, they're a tiny number of people against a very large group of suitors. So there's a kind of plot related challenge. And, part of that issue is that Odysseus is the hero of guile and trickery, but Homer is also going to give him his big exploit, his big, amazing moment of slaughtering a huge number of people, right? So at the plot level, that is going to take some time to work out or set up. Um, there's also a sense at the level of character where at the ending, the process of ending is going to be very prolonged, the character both of the hero and of the story. So Odysseus, this Polytropos Odysseus, is the hero of a narrative which I would call polytropic. And I come back to this tension between turning and returning, or the adventures and the nostos. So there is a question here about whether Odysseus is capable of stopping, of stopping traveling and of stopping, twisting and turning. Is he capable of settling down? Can he stop? And I don't, some of you have probably encountered these other versions of Odysseus where he doesn't stop. You know, in Canto 26 of Dante's Inferno, he and Dante could not read Homer, right? So he had access to the story of Ulysses through Virgil and through other things. But for Dante, Ulysses gets home and then he sets off again on his adventures, and he never returns. And Tennyson's Ulysses, the same, right? He's home for a bit and then he sets out again. And there are ancient traditions as well featuring Odysseus, the nonstop traveler. So in the Telegony, which I don't think has come up yet, maybe it has. I can't remember if it's come up in the series. It's a poem in the epic cycle, which kind of picks up at the end of the Odyssey, and it's a wild story. But the thing that I'm interested in here is that Odysseus sets off after he deals with all the stuff he deals with in the Odyssey. He sets off for Thesprotia. He marries a queen in Thesprotia, and he fights some battle. There's just all kinds of stuff. So again, even in the ancient tradition, people had their doubts about whether Odysseus was ever going to stop turning. Um, and I think Tiresias's prophecy is kind of interesting, and I'm not going to read it to you, but Tiresias's prophecy in the underworld, I think one thing that prophecy is trying to do is to say, yes, Odysseus is going to go on one more journey, but the whole point of that journey is to enable him to stop traveling. So he's going to go off with the oar on his shoulder until someone thinks it's a winnowing fan. They can't even recognize a sort of nautical instrument. They assume it's agricultural. At that point, he does the whole thing for Poseidon. And then Tiresias says, you're going to go home and you're going to die in a rich old age surrounded by your people. So this poem projects for him a future which really will be a stable future of return. So, that, my sense of one thing that's going on in the second half of the Odyssey is that it's taking up the challenge of converting this Polytropos, many turning hero, into Odysseus, the husband of Penelope, the father of Telemachus, the king of Ithaca, right? I mean, it's not like he's going to stop being clever, wily Odysseus, but he's going to have to resume that identity, and that is something that is going to take time. I also love the fact that in that wonderful scene between Odysseus and Athena, who's the first person who recognizes him or who greets him once he arrives in Ithaca, Athena adores Odysseus. It's such a wonderful scene. But she adores him precisely because he can never stop telling lies. She just thinks anyone else would at this point would stop, would be done, but not you. And I have to say, keep the scene in mind when you get to the scene between Odysseus and Penelope. Okay, because this works for Athena, but it's not going to work for the other woman in his life. Penelope is going to need something really different from him before she can accept him back. Okay, so one very striking thing when Odysseus arrives in Ithaca finally is that he doesn't recognize it, right? You remember this. Cecily mentioned this moment. And interestingly, there are two different explanations given for why he doesn't recognize Ithaca on his arrival. This is about on page 272. The noble Odysseus woke up from his sleep in the land of his fathers, but failed to recognize it, so long had he been away. And then we get the second explanation. For the goddess Pallas Athena, daughter of Zeus, had poured a mist around it so it would be unrecognizable to him, and she could explain everything. Okay, so these explanations are that they're a little different from each other, and I kind of like the one. I mean, I accept them both, but I like the fact that Odysseus actually can't recognize Ithaca, perhaps not only because Athena has put mist around it, but because he's been away for 20 years, right? So he's alienated in a sense by just that sheer gap of time that he's been away for. And it takes a while for him to be able to believe Athena that he is actually back, and she has to dispel the mist and show him all the landmarks. And then he really knows he's home. Okay. So what happens? How does Odysseus make this journey? So part of it, um, part of it gets done through the very lies that he tells. And I'm not actually going to have that much to say about these lies. They're really famous. Cecily's touched on them already. They're the so-called Cretan tales, right? He tells a series of stories in which he claims to be a Cretan. He tells one to Athena. He tells a very long one to Eumaeus, and he's going to tell yet another one later on in the poem. And I think Mendelssohn points out, and various people discuss the fact that they kind of build on each other. They pick up on dimensions of his experience, but they also obviously deviate in important ways. He in this he tends to represent himself as very warlike. He doesn't name himself. His status gradually increases across these stories. So there's a sense in these stories, it's as if he's kind of gradually both shielding his identity and reconstructing his identity in the course of telling these stories. And it's that wonderful touch that Eumaeus believes everything in the stories except the part that's true. What he says, Odysseus is actually coming back. So there's a kind of, he can tell the truth about Odysseus in the third person potentially, but getting the third person and the first person back together is going to take a long time and be quite a challenge. Okay. Um, Time. So I wanted to think a little bit about the impact of this gap in time, um, on two characters, on Eumaeus and on Telemachus. And Telemachus, you've heard quite a bit about already, and you know him well. Professor Kirk talked about him quite a bit, and just about the challenges to Telemachus because he's grown up without a father. Um, I want to start with Eumaeus because the poem spends a lot of time with Eumaeus and addresses him directly, right? Is clearly very attached to him. So there's some kind of curious details in the account of Eumaeus. So one of them is we get a long description of his stockade, of this complicated, elaborate, large structure that he has built for housing all his swine. Um, and as Mendelssohn has a great note on this, actually, but as people have long since noticed, this passage echoes the description of the palace of Priam from the Iliad. Priam being the king of Troy, extremely wealthy with this enormous palace. And there are all kinds of details here, like the number 50. It seemed to pick up on that, but it's kind of odd. And it's even odd that it gets as much attention as it does. And another kind of surprising detail about Eumaeus is that he's described with a formula, leader of men, orchamos andron, which is usually used of kind of important people, like important warriors in the Iliad. So there's something about Eumaeus that is a bit larger than we might have expected for a swineherd. And just from a Latinist perspective, I have to say that this kind of dimension of Eumaeus gets picked up by Virgil, who then retranslates Eumaeus into a king, Evander, that Aeneas encounters in the second half of the Aeneid. But that's just a sidelight. Okay, so uh, Eumaeus also gets to tell a story, and actually, quite a long story to Odysseus. Odysseus is interested in hearing about his history. This is on pages 310 to 12, if I can find it. And Okay. Yes, here it is. Okay, so they're sitting around together in book 15, and Odysseus sort of wants to know more about him, and he tells a whole story, and it's interesting because it's late at night. The story goes almost till dawn. It's a little bit analogous to Odysseus telling his story to the Phaeacians, where it gets very late at night and they stay up all the same, enthralled by the story. So here they sit around and Eumaeus tells his story. And his story, there are a couple of things about it that are really interesting. One is that it turns out, according to the story, he's the son of a king, right? So he's royal in origin. Perhaps this explains some of the, elevated details that get associated with him. Um, and the other thing we learn is that he was kidnapped, when there's this whole story about his Phoenician slave nanny who, some Phoenicians come to town and she gets going with them, and then she basically kidnaps him, and then she drops dead on the ship of the Phoenicians, and then they end up selling him to Odysseus's father Laertes. Okay, so it's a powerful story, and Odysseus is impressed by it, and perhaps he knew it before, perhaps he didn't. But one thing that I'm very struck by in this story is that it's clearly a fiction, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's a lie. It may be true in some sense, but it's absolutely fictionalized. If you reread the story, ask yourself, how does Eumaeus know? Like, he was like a toddler. How does he know the conversations that his nanny had off stage with those Phoenicians? I mean, it is crafted and not as well crafted as Odysseus's story, right? Because Odysseus is actually pretty careful to cover his tracks and ensure that everything he says can kind of be accounted for, not Eumaeus. So, nonetheless, it's an excellent story, and Odysseus really appreciates it, and it goes over really well. But I like the fact that Eumaeus is a kind of story crafter like Odysseus. And to me, there's a little bit of a suggestion in this poem that Eumaeus, who is, of course, absolutely devoted to Odysseus. I mean, he's completely loyal. He expresses his devotion repeatedly and unprompted, so there's no doubt he's an absolutely loyal retainer, but there's also a trace of a sense that he's a kind of double for Odysseus or a replacement for Odysseus. And one detail that makes me think this comes before he actually gets into his story. Um, After Odysseus asks him about Laertes and Anticlea, right? Odysseus asks about his parents. He says, well, Laertes is still around, but Anticlea died, right? Wasted away with grief. And then he says something kind of interesting. For she was the one who raised me, along with her noble daughter Ctimene of the loose flowing gown, the last of the children she bore. I grew up with her, and her mother honored me scarcely any less. But once the two of us reached the beautiful noon of youth, they married her off, right? And as for me, my lady gave me a cloak and a tunic and dressed me in these fine clothes and, sent me off in the fields, although she still really loved me. Okay. What I find really curious here is, where is Odysseus? I mean, Eumaeus is raised alongside Odysseus's sister by Odysseus's mother. And in this passage, there is no mention of Odysseus. So it's as if Eumaeus is kind of taken over that slot temporarily. I mean, of course, he's a slave and he ends up being sent off to the fields, but there's some kind of issue there about their relationship. And in fact, uh, you know, at the start of book 16, in that wonderful moment when Telemachus shows up, he does explicitly take the place of Telemachus's father, right? So this is pages 315 to 16, right? It's, and Odysseus says, someone's come, and the dogs know who it is, right? The dogs are not barking at Telemachus, whereas they did bark at Odysseus, right? They were ready to attack him because they do not know him. There will be another dog that does recognize Odysseus. And by the way, that's another thing that you often get in these scenes of, someone arriving somewhere is a dog, right? The Phaeacians have gold and silver dogs, which seems just perfect. Eumaeus has fierce dogs that help guard his pigs. Okay, so he had hardly got the words out when, behold, his beloved son was standing in the doorway. Okay, his beloved son, Odysseus's beloved son. And the thing that happens next is the swineherd leaps up. Eumaeus leaps up, right? Drops the bowl in which he was mixing the wine and goes and embraces Telemachus. And it says, he went and stood in front of his master, kissing him all over his head, both his shining eyes, both his hands as well. The hot tears came pouring down, as a father might embrace the child he loves so dearly, who's returned from a far off land after being away for 10 years, his darling only child for whom he had toiled so much. That's how the splendid swineherd clung to godlike Telemachus, kissing him all over as if he'd escaped from death itself, which he actually has, right? Because he's managed to avoid the suitors so far, so good. Okay, and he addresses him as dear child and so on. So this is a scene that Odysseus witnesses, right? The reunion of Eumaeus and Telemachus, and it's a scene from which at the moment, thus far, he is excluded. So, and this is not surprising. I mean, there's nothing surprising about this. Odysseus has been gone for 20 years, and Eumaeus really has filled the role of a kind of surrogate father for Telemachus, and that's a good thing that he has done that, although clearly he has not been able to provide the kind of paternal modeling, and education that would have enabled Telemachus to kind of mature and grow up and become, ready to do the next thing. But nonetheless, this relationship strikes me as really interesting. So, there's a sense with Eumaeus where, on the one hand, he's completely devoted to Odysseus and desperate for him to return, although pretty much in despair at this point, or doubting, not allowing himself to hope anymore that he might return. But there's also a sense in which the absence of Odysseus has made a space for Eumaeus to kind of thrive and develop in ways that would not have happened had Odysseus been there. I mean, he would have fared well and been a good slave to his master, and he would have been treated really well, but he wouldn't be the big man that he has become. So, 20 years for Eumaeus, I think, have not been altogether simply negative. Okay. All right. I want to talk a little bit about Telemachus. I mean, Telemachus is actually and is actually meant to be another potential double or replacement for Odysseus in another sense, in the generational sense. This is the way it's supposed to work. Sons grow up and they succeed their fathers and they inherit, right? They step into that role. So Telemachus seems like a good match for that. Everyone tells him how much he looks like his father, right? I also, even though he hasn't had the proper paternal modeling, Athena has stepped in to help out as mentees and mentor and escorting him on this journey. I mean, he's still a bit of a kid, as you can tell, that when he wakes up in the middle of the night, says to Pisistratus, we got to hit the road, we got to hit the road. And Pisistratus says, we really can't travel in the middle of the night. He's still kind of endearingly young, but he's getting there. And it's also worth noting that he's, presumably he's about 20 years old. Let's say he's 21 or so. I am assuming he is roughly the age that Odysseus was, roughly, when Odysseus left for Troy. I mean, somewhere in that neighborhood. So he's kind of at that moment of being a potential successor to his father. And that's not gonna happen in this poem. I mean, this is the Odyssey. We had our Telemachy, but this is the Odyssey, and the Odyssey wants to get Odysseus home and get Odysseus back in place. But there is a little bit of an issue here with the son potentially displacing the father, and this actually is going to come up in a big way. I mean, this potential is going to be forestalled in book 21. You'll see there's a kind of amazing moment with Telemachus seeming like he actually could take the place of his father. I will also mention, as long as I'm on generations, that another thing about the way this epic is organized is to kind of track from Telemachus in the early books to Odysseus, and it is going to end by getting to Laertes. So it's going to kind of cover those three. Um, those three generations. Now, I feel like I should be leaving some time for questions, shouldn't I? I have a few more things I want to say. Cecily, tell me.
You have about 10 more minutes, so if
Okay.
so far we haven't we've had a few questions in the chat,
Okay.
but I think if
Okay.
you want to take another five or
Okay. I'm going to take another five.
yeah.
Okay. Or roughly, let's say. Um, okay. So this issue about the gap in time and Telemachus, right? It comes through also in a very profound way and really powerful way in the incredibly painful recognition scene, so-called, between Odysseus and Telemachus. And this is one of those ways in which I think this poem is so weirdly contemporary, or I don't know, insightful, the way that scene is handled. So you will remember that at the end of book 13, Athena disguises Odysseus, right? So this is page 280. If I can find it. I want to read you just a few at the end of book 13. 280. Yes. Okay. So, she's setting off to Eumaeus, but first she tapped him with her wand. She dried up the beautiful skin that covered his supple limbs and made the fair hair on his head disappear. And then she covered each and every limb with hide such as old men have, then dimmed the light in his eyes, both of which were so splendid. And then she gives him horrible clothes to wear. Okay, so this is what he looks like when he's in, when he's with Eumaeus in Eumaeus's steading. So for the recognition with Telemachus, which is done at Athena's instigation, she says, okay, it's time, Eumaeus has left, it's time to identify yourself to your son. She reverses this. Okay, this is page 320. Then Athena tapped him with a golden wand. First, she covered his torso with a spotlessly laundered tunic and cloak, then enhanced his build and restored the bloom of youth. His healthy color returned, his cheeks grew taut once more, the bristling beard came back on his chin. Okay. Then he goes in to see Telemachus, and Telemachus is naturally terrified, and assumes this is a god. I mean, this does not seem possible for a mortal person. He's completely freaked out. And then Odysseus says, no, why compare me to the immortals? No, I am your father. So saying, he kissed his son, right? But Telemachus, who did not believe in the least that this was his father, spoke in reply once again, no, you can't be Odysseus, not my father, right? There's no way a mortal man could manage to bring all this off by using his wits alone, not unless some god were to come and easily, just by willing it, make him young or old, right? For a moment ago, you were old and dressed in disgusting rags, but now you look like the gods who dwell in the far-flung heavens. Okay, that's a very good point, right? And Odysseus makes an amazing reply. Telemachus, it isn't right for you to be so astounded or to be so awestruck on seeing your father in this place, for there is no other Odysseus who will come back here for you. Here I am, just as you see me. I suffered evil, and so forth and so on. I'm back. And then Telemachus is like, okay, I guess you're Odysseus, or you're the only Odysseus I'm going to get. So that's probably, I'm just going to have to accept it. And then there's that beautiful simile, both of them weeping. Bitterly they keened, crying more shrilly than birds, ospreys, or bent-clawed vultures, whose young some country folks snatched out of the nest before they were fully fledged. That's how pitiful were the tears they shed from beneath their brows. Right? Okay. So that simile is about birds that have lost their young. And in effect, what it's registering is the fact that they have not had a life together, right? Of course, Telemachus can't recognize his father. He's never seen, I mean, he hasn't seen his father. Did he see him? Odysseus left when he was a baby. He doesn't know his father. He doesn't know what his father looks like, except perhaps that his father is supposed to look like him, right? Or he's supposed to look like his father. And there is no recognition token that Odysseus can persuasively give him. I mean, I suppose he could say something about Ithaca, but how would that really be persuasive? There is no knowledge that they in particular share. And this situation is going to be radically different with Penelope and with Laertes. And in both those cases, there's a kind of private, intimate knowledge that dates from the relationship that they had back in the day before Odysseus left that can be evoked and invoked to kind of ensure that recognition. But here there is nothing. So it's a kind of brutal recognition scene in that sense, and that there's no substance to it. There's no relation there. And that's part of what they're weeping for, I think. Okay, so after that scene, this is the last thing I want to mention, because I'm just kind of always amazed by this. So Athena comes back in and she does the disguise again. Because Eumaeus is coming back, right? So this is on page 328. I don't really need to, well, it's a quick passage. She tapped him with her wand, turning him into an old man once again, right? To disguise him so that he can continue his thing. And he's going to keep this disguise when he goes to see, actually is going to make it to the palace, and he's going to hang out with the horrible suitors. And, you know, so he's going to keep that disguise. Okay, here is the thing that blows my mind. Athena never retransforms him. She never removes that disguise. She never removes that disguise. There is a moment for the reunion with Penelope where she kind of makes him prettier, but there is never a moment where she restores him. And if you think about it, the notion that she's restoring him to the way he actually looks, or in book 13 that she's disguising him by getting rid of his, you know, taut skin and all his youthful beauty, she's this is who Odysseus is, right? 20 years have passed. He's been at war for 10 years and buffeted around on the sea for another 10. He is an old man, right? And, that's the truth that the poem kind of both registers and sidesteps, but I love the fact that he just remains that way. I mean, as you'll see, there's a fantasy in this poem occasionally, right? About turning back the clock, that somehow you could cancel out those lost 20 years. And Penelope and Odysseus could somehow have the marriage they didn't have, the prime of their life. But the poem also recognizes that fantasy for what it is. And that's one of the things I love about it. I don't know if some of you must know Shakespeare's play, The Winter's Tale. And there's that fantastic moment at the end where Leontes is looking at Hermione. Supposedly it's a statue of his wife from whom he's been divided also for years. And he says something like, well, that doesn't look like her. She was nothing like so wrinkled and so old, as if you could turn back the clock, but you can't. Anyway, and that's in a sense the hardest lesson of this poem. And that is everything I have to say. Or I will stop there. It's not everything I have to say.
Thank you so much, Professor
Yeah.
Oliensis. That was, yeah, really fantastic. I feel like you helped me understand why Eumaeus's hut a little bit more, why that's such an important meeting point for kind of sorting out these different identities and substitutions. Um, we have a few questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So one specific question from Catherine is, could you comment on the night journey aspect of Odysseus's journey back to Ithaca?
Mm-hmm.
He's wrapped in sheets like a corpse. Is there
Yeah.
some connection with death,
Yeah.
rebirth?
Yes.
How should we interpret that?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question and a really good comment. So yes, there is this kind of like I can't really say it better. I mean, it is like a death rebirth thing. And this is one time also, by the way, when it's okay for Odysseus to fall asleep. Normally, when Odysseus falls asleep, it's really bad news. That's what happens with the cattle of the sun, right? So he falls asleep, things go horribly wrong. There's this issue throughout the Odyssey of keeping your mind focused, not forgetting your return, never relinquishing your kind of intellectual control or your sense of where you're going. That's part of the problem with the lotus eaters. But this is a moment when finally it's okay. He can sleep, he can relinquish control. But I think it also is very much kind of like a marking that passage from one life or one world into another. Yeah.
I'm seeing as well a question from Marjan that's being echoed by Fiona, which is you touched on this a bit that we get to Laertes at the end, but why Laertes doesn't step in as the father figure? Why is it Eumaeus,
Yeah.
this more
Yeah.
horizontal or subservient figure?
Yeah. That is a fantastic question, which I do not think I can answer. And I don't know that the poem answers it. I mean, there's an interesting moment here where um, Eumaeus says, should we send a message to Laertes? Right. I'm going to send a message to Penelope and tell her that you're okay. Shall I send a message to Laertes? And Telemachus says, no, Penelope can send a message. And it's always struck me as a little bit odd. I mean, why? But clearly Laertes has withdrawn and has been incapable of doing what he should have done, which is step up and step into the void left by Odysseus's departure. So, I mean, Laertes is a really interesting figure, and we meet him in book 24 in a very, very painful scene. And maybe when you get there, you all, if you have this on your minds, you you may have thoughts about this very question. But that's all I can say is he doesn't. He should, but he doesn't.
We should go to breakout rooms, but I see that there's just one more question. So maybe if you have a response to it, which is on Alcinous saying, collecting from the people to pay ourselves back
Yeah,
for Odysseus's expensive gifts.
yeah.
Like, it seems Ruben is asking, doesn't that demean the gifts? What's
Yeah,
happening here?
yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I think it's a kind of a fabulously realistic moment or something with the Phaeacians, like that actually this is an aristocratic culture that has people there to be exploited. But it's a very curious detail, and I really don't know what to say about it. I feel a little sorry that, we didn't get to talk about the Phaeacians more and that whole crazy thing where we leave them in the middle of a line in the imperfect tense, praying to Poseidon. We never find out, you know. So that's an amazing moment, but not for me to talk about now. So no, I can't answer that question about,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's too much
Yeah.
in each of these books. So we should go to breakout rooms, but thank you so much, Professor Oliensis, for this wonderful lecture and for taking us through these books. I think we're really set up well for all the rest of the second half. So
Great.
thank
I'll have
you.
fun. Bye.
And thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy the breakout rooms. We'll see you again soon. Enjoy.